So good afternoon, everybody. And first, let me thank Dora and Charlotte for putting together this very nice session on the ontogeny of social influences on memory and communication in infants and young children. So that's a bit of a long title. Actually, there might have been a shorter title, which would have been the ontogeny of alter-centric cognition. So here we have 3 talks illustrating and investigating the striking influence of the perspective of others on what is encoded and recalled. And this makes it for a perfect companion to the keynote by Vicky Southgate. So if you think about it, if alter-centric effects are pervasive, then they will have a very important relevance for the way we think about the ontogeny of social cognition. We already discussed about the implication of this hypothesis for the way we conceive of infants' representations of mental states, but more broadly for social cognition and thinking about the way infants might interact with others. Try to think a bit about the way, for example, it might change the way infants interact with someone in a communicative situation. And more broadly, if these effects are pervasive, it means that they really transform the whole of infants' learning landscape, therefore having a broad relevance for the study of learning at large, and so for the study of infants' cognition at large. So we had 3 talks trying to broaden and deepen the study of alter-centric cognition. Dora looking at the way this effect might apply not just to the location of objects, but also to the kind of objects, kind of information, and having effects on semantic processing. Bartug investigating the way these effects might be triggered not just by visual perspective taking, but also by monitoring other sources of information, such as communication. And Marie-Louise looking at the way or Marie, can I say Marie, by the way, because that's what I put on the slides. Okay, and Marie looking at the emergence of novel representational resources supporting in particular the explicit representations of beliefs might generate novel alter-centric effects. So let's have a look at the way these 3 talks are contributing to refine our understanding about alter-centric cognition, focusing on specific key hypotheses about the nature and functioning of alter-centric cognition. So what is alter-centric cognition? There are different ways to characterize it. It is a type of social influence on cognition, but it's more specific, and usually it's associated with specific mechanisms and hypotheses about the ontogeny and the function of alter-centric cognition. So let's have first a look at the mechanisms. So because first evidence for types of alter-centric effects were found in tasks in which the presence of an agent would influence participants' performance in tasks for which the presence of an agent was entirely irrelevant, such as detecting an object or counting a number of dots. It has been sometimes suggested that the triggering conditions for this alter-centric effect might be automatic, such that they would be necessarily triggered once its input conditions are fulfilled, and therefore once an agent is present. Now, as Marie suggested and illustrated with her study, the fact that in adults, when participants are first tested in a task requiring to predict the behavior of an agent based on a false belief, enhances their tendency to show an alter-centric effect, already suggests that in adults, those effects are not automatic. Their triggering is more subtle and sensitive, in fact, to the context that make it relevant to process the mental states of agents. But I would argue that today's studies are also suggesting that the same might apply to infants and children. So if you look at Dora Bartug's and Marie's studies, this time with children, in all of these studies, one could argue that the effect of agents' presence varies depending on the way they interact with participants. So in all of these studies, you have multiple agent scenarios. You don't have just a single agent. You have one focal agent that is the putative source of the alter-centric effect. And then you also have other agents that are acting as experimental props, that are displacing objects, moving them around, and so on and so forth. Now, I would argue that if all these agents had the same effect in triggering alter-centric effects, then we would not observe the pattern of results that Dora, Bartug, and Marie have observed. So take Dora's study, for example. You have first an agent hiding an object in the box, and so the presence of the agent here and her perspective should enhance the encoding of this event, but then the object is displaced yet by another agent. So this should, if an alter-centric effect was automatically triggered in this case. This should enhance the encoding of the change of object inside the box here, and this would yield no effect eventually when the label is either consistent or inconsistent with the first agent's perspective. So the fact that the first agent has a stronger impact here in triggering an alter-centric effect suggests that indeed the effect of agents' presence varies depending on the way they interact with participants. And in all of this study, in Dora's, Bartug's, and Mary's study, one key factor is precisely that the central focal agents that are the putative source of the alter-centric effects are actually engaging in an interaction with the child, looking at the child in Dora's case, but in Bartug's and Mary's study, directly communicating with the child, all situations that enhance against the relevance of processing the mental states of the agent. So not an automatic process, a smarter process that is context-sensitive and in particular sensitive to the relevance of computing agents' mental states. Now, if we think about the outputs of these mechanisms, a defining characteristic of these alter-centric effects is that they generate memory errors, so a bias to encode co-witnessed events over events witnessed alone. And here I think we should be careful in distinguishing carefully genuine alter-centric effects characterized by these biases and classic uses of socio-cognitive abilities where one is spontaneously recruiting representations of perspectives or mental states to interact with others. And actually, I have to say, to thank Balint and Charlotte for introducing this, because in Bartug's study, we observed that infants are more likely to point to the initially baited location in a false belief condition than in a true belief condition. One interpretation is that infants' representation of the location of the toy is somewhat modulated by the belief of the agent. But as people have already noticed, an alternative interpretation is that infant might point to the empty location as a way to establish reference about the toy and its displacement, taking into account the false belief of the agent. What is crucial here is that under this interpretation, infants need not align their belief with the experimenter's belief. Now, there is external support for such an interpretation, and first of all, the fact that at the very same age, toddlers show no strong alter-centric bias in comparable tasks testing representations of false beliefs, studied by Vicky and other people. If you had a modulation of the memory of participants in these tasks that are comparable to Bartug's tasks in the sense that there is an induction of false belief, you would not observe the results that they have observed. And also we know that by 12 months of age, from Wolf studies, that infants can actually point to empty locations to refer to objects that occupied that location before. All of this to say that this bias to encode co-witnessed event over events witnessed alone is indeed a central defining feature of this alter-centric effect, and that we should be careful in not overextending too much the characterization of what it means for an effect to be alter-centric, and that this should be a key signature. Now, if we look at the ontogeny, we observe that the data is revealed two evidence for developmental discontinuities. First, an ontogenetic decrease during infancy, shown in Mary's talk and Dora's talk, and then an ontogenetic increase in children's data, shown in Mary's talk. And very briefly, one way to think about this two developmental trajectory is that you have a U-shaped trajectory. That's what you suggested, Mary, but an alternative possibility is that this distinct developmental trajectory might be related to very different ways of processing representations of mental states. One reason to believe that this might be the case is the fact that the emergence of alter-centric effects observed in children is actually co-occurring with the emergence of novel capacities to explicitly represent mental states in standard false belief tasks. So it could be that the alter-centric effect that you observed in your task are specifically tied to this specific type of representation of mental state. In other words, that these alter-centric effects might not be a unitary phenomenon, but might be connected to different types of representations of mental states. The data is somewhat also relevant to address the broad hypothesis and provocative hypothesis that Victoria Southgate put together in her keynote talk, namely that infants might be strongly alter-centric, with a decrease in alter-centrism with the onset of one's own self-perspective. Notice that this hypothesis is not a single hypothesis. In fact, it includes two distinct hypotheses with two distinct explanatory agendas. One is to account for a decrease in alter-centrism, an increase of the effect of others' perspective on one's own representation of reality, and an increase in egocentrism, an increase in one's own tendency to use one's own representation of reality when predicting and interpreting the behavior of others. And these are really two distinct phenomena, and so these are really two distinct hypotheses that should be considered separately. Now, the data presented here speaks primarily about the decrease in alter-centrism, and in a nutshell, what it shows is that indeed you do have a decrease during infancy, but I would like to stress that it's not, well, it's a possibility that it might be related to the emergence of a self-perspective. Many, many, many other possibilities are just equally plausible. And for instance, the fact that in Dora's case there is no connection with mirror self-recognition should raise the possibility that alternatives are possible. So in this alter-centric effect, what happens? You have a representation of reality that is influenced by someone else's perspective. Now, if children's now there is no doubt, first of all, that children form a representation of reality before they can form a representation of their self-perspective on reality. So what is critical and what develops even before the emergence of a self-perspective on reality is the child's representation of reality. An improvement in their capacity to represent reality with confidence should yield indeed a decrease in alter-centrism, irrespective of the emergence of a self-perspective. Just to say that there are many possibilities, what this general view predicts is that you would have a general decrease in alter-centrism during the first years of life, but it would not be specifically tied to the representation of self-perspective. But that's, of course, to be investigated. And just a quick word about functions. So because Dora alluded to the putative learning functions, for instance, of these mechanisms, I just wanted to address the elephant in the room, namely that in all those tasks, what we observe are surprising failures to learn. I mean, surprising memory failures. So it's frankly quite counterintuitive to claim that these alter-centric effects are naturally interpreted in terms of serving a learning function. And one way to directly address this question of function would be to, in future research, to look for actual signatures such that the putative function of these effects might modulate the strength of these alter-centric effects. For instance, if alter-centric effects are tied to a learning function, they might be enhanced in situations where when there is an opportunity for learning and when the opportunities, the learning gains are enhanced, perhaps if the learning landscape is more complex and therefore there is a stronger need to rely on other persons to guide one's own learning, but also depending on the type of agent and the type of information it may provide. So altogether, 3 studies showing very interesting results about the striking influence of the perspective of others on what is encoded and recalled, and bringing a field, I think, also forward by showing that perhaps you might have that alter-centric effects might not be an homogeneous phenomenon, but that it might be underpinned by several distinct mechanisms that develop across distinct ontogenetic pathways. And I will stop here to leave a little bit of time for questions. Thank you.
Yeah, we have time for 1 or 2 very short questions.
And questions to any of our speakers, I assume. So if you could just... Yeah. If our speakers could come with me, no?
Okay. Can I? Okay, let me just have a short comment. Hi, I'm here. To Olivier's discussion about the elephant of the room, which is not me, but the issue of learning here. So you notice this, the failure of learning here, practically. But these are, what the failure in all of these cases was the failure of encoding or remembering locations, right? Which is actually not very relevant for learning. So maybe elephant of room is the question of maybe they are focusing other types of information, and actually there's some earlier data from even young babies that depending on what kind of situation they observe others interacting with objects, have different effect of encoding location or what kind of objects there are in the situation, which is, again, it's a kind of alter-centric effect, but it's modulated by the actual nature of the interaction. And Hanna is in the room, and actually it was replicated also in adults.
I wasn't sure I could hear what were you saying? That the failure in learning is related to encoding of location, but the mechanisms might be beneficial for supporting learning of other properties. No, that's indeed the kind of functional signature that I think one should look for if one wants to make the argument that these mechanisms serve a learning function.
I just wanted to thank everyone in this symposium and Vicky for the keynote. Learning more and getting up to date on this topic is really interesting, and I really appreciate your comments too, because one thing that occurs to me as a developmentally minded cognitive person is, are we making claims about developmental continuity or discontinuity? And I think, as you're pointing out, that matters what the unit of analysis is. If the unit is what do they remember, you see yes and no. But it may vary as a function of what who the other agent is, or whether the other agent is, as you've pointed out, related. So I really feel like the frontier that this group has come with is terrific. And now the question that's really exciting is, what does this really mean about the development of mind? And by that I mean mind of self and mind of others, and what are the inputs to each over development. I'd be surprised to see discontinuities, but that's just my preference. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you very much.
I don't know whether you're allowed.
Thank you for this comment, and yeah, I just wanted to reply in 2 words. I think that's absolutely right. Like, these are raising a lot more questions than they answer. And I would also add that the question of continuity is also like, what are the boundary conditions? What are the things that influence it? So it's not necessarily discontinuity, and there's something fundamentally different. Maybe it is. But it could be just that there's dynamics that are at play. So that's what we'll need to spend our time with. Thank you.
I think those were really nice final words, and let's thank everyone again.